Hi, this is Paul. January is past, February is here, and what that means for the Christian Reformed Church is that classes are going to start having their spring meeting. February, March for the most part, and in February, March, spring classes will begin to think ahead to Synod 2025 and the monumental changes that have happened in the last three synods of the Christian Reformed Church. And as we start heading into the classis season, ministers are starting to think ahead to classis seasons, and there'll be overtures that have been gotten ready in a variety of ways, churches and clergy that have been put under limited suspension. They've been trying to figure out what they're going to do. We had a Christian Reformed Church online Estuary Friday live stream a couple of weeks ago that if you're a member of the Christian Reformed Church and you haven't watched that, you really should. It's excellent. I'll try to remember to put it in the notes below, and if I don't, ask for it in the comments, and then I will give you a link to that conversation about the Christian Reformed Church. It was really good. We had participation from a variety of perspectives in the Christian Reformed Church. One of the most important voices and most helpful voices that I've seen in the last couple of years is Kent Hendricks. Kent and what's his relationship to Clay? I had Kent and Clay Leibold on for a conversation a while back. And Kent has been writing Substacks every now and then, and he just posted a brand new one about Abide. Abide's post-Synod 2024 narrative relies on a false dichotomy. Synod 2024 was historic. As with any historic event, there's an attempt to frame it, how it happened and what it means. The adage that the history is written by the winners is true, and it's especially true in the CRC right now. I don't know about that. There's going to be a lot of history written about these watershed synods from 2022 to 2024. And if you go back and look at the videos that I've made along this time, you'll probably note that I said back in 2022, this is not the only synod. We have synod every year. And so what tends to happen is that synods build on each other, but they also move directions and things move around. And so the story is by no means older. The losers certainly aren't writing it. Well, I'm not sure about that. On CRC Voices, the losers are writing plenty. And in fact, given all of the skill sets that many of I'll call them the exiles, once they are exiled, they are not yet exiled, but they're probably, a lot of them probably in the process of, there's a lot of writers and academics and scholars in that group, and they will certainly write plenty. Moderates are hunking down and keeping quiet. I'm not so sure that's true either. And that's what we're going to get to. And then he said, the emerging Abide narrative, Dutch culture versus confessions. And I talked about this in the post-synod shows, especially where there was what I call Rita's cry, where she asks, will my children be able to be Christian Reformed? Now, I agree with Kent to a degree that in some ways people are seeing in terms of Dutch culture versus confessions. And I basically agree with his post that neither have quite been what we thought they were. And I think what he tracks, or at least what he points to here, is that the Christian Reformed Church has long sort of had two sides. And for a lot of the, let's say, adaptive liberationist years from the 70s to the 90s, back when Andy Kuyvenhoven wrote It's Time to Burn the Wooden Shoes, and I've talked about that. So in YouTube, if you're fairly new to YouTube, there are playlists, and there's a Christian Reformed playlist, and you can find all my videos about the Christian Reformed Church in one place. So when Andy Kuyvenhoven wrote It's Time to Burn the Wooden Shoes, let me pull up that banner cover. November 3, 1980, It's Time to Burn the Wooden Shoes, and that was sort of right in the middle of what I would say, well, I'm going to give a schema because after reading a bunch of this stuff this morning and reflecting on a bunch of other things that I'll mention, I wrote a rather lengthy CRC Voices blog post where I basically walked through a lot of Christian Reformed history through the lens of what's been happening right now, and we'll talk about a bunch of that. But of course, Kuyvenhoven's article just sent a shudder through the CRC, and the two sides, and there were two sides by this point, by 1980. I graduated from high school in 1981 from a Christian Reformed high school, and then I went to Calvin College, Christian Reformed school, deep within the denomination. That sent a shudder through the denomination of, are you telling us we should feel guilty about burning Dutch? Burning Dutch. He should feel guilty about burning Dutch, about being Dutch. Because at that point, the civil rights movement was just sort of cooling down in the broader culture and heating up even more and more in the CRC culture. Remember, 1980, you have the election of Ronald Reagan. So right then, too, you have sort of this larger cultural, political turn to the right with Ronald Reagan. So that's an important moment in the Christian Reformed Church. And the CRC progressives at this point were basically trying to downplay Dutchness. Let's not lean into our Dutchness at all because our Dutchness is exclusive and maybe even feels a little racist or too exclusive of other people. And already by 1980, there was an understanding that the Christian Reformed Church is going to need to look beyond itself. And so Christian Reformed Home Missions, which was responsible for helping the denomination plant new churches and do outreach in the United States and Canada, Christian Reformed Home Missions not yet hit the seeker wave, and I'll talk about that when I get to the main document that I wrote this morning, but was already thinking about evangelism. And at this point, was already taking on certain evangelistic things from, let's say, the Jesus movement, because the Jesus movement sort of sets up the seeker movement. Some CRCs, like the one I was growing up in, singing more African-American songs by then, singing more Jesus movement songs. You've already got sort of the departure from, let's say, more highly liturgical, regulated liturgy in churches and the movement towards more folk music stuff or ethnic music, celebration of Black History Month. So again, at this point in 1980, the group that would become a lot of the exiles, they were obviously the boomers at that point. They were just sort of really getting into their power and their strength years. They were all leaning towards downplaying the Dutchness of the denomination and upplaying, I would say, the cultural accommodation. And again, I'm going to get to that in the narrative. Now, what I like a lot of what Kent wrote. Denominations preserve history. They do. Denominations preserve norms. They do. Grand Rapids at the center of the institutional network. It was, especially by the 1980s. And here he references my circulatory system idea. Let's tie these three separate ideas together. Number one, that the function of the denomination, insofar as they are institutions, are preserving historical memory. Two, another functional denomination, insofar as they are institutions, is to establish and preserve norms. Three, that churches near to the CRC's institutional center are more efficient at both preserving history and following norms compared to the churches at the periphery, simply by virtue of their proximity to the center of the network and their ability to take advantage of the agglomeration efficiencies that come with its position at the center. Now, this is really key because part of how this happens in institutions is that institutions basically sample for it. So if you get hired by the Christian Reformed Church, you get brought into Grand Rapids, and then you get acculturated, and the groupthink starts, and everybody sort of starts to stay in the same mind, and everybody starts to start to conform, and so say we all, and this is the way we think. And of course, by 1980, the war over women in church office is really getting going. By the time I'm in seminary in the late 1980s, early 1990s, late 1980s, it's reaching its peak. The war over women in church office in the Christian Reformed Church. Churches near the CRC's institutional center are more likely to tie their collective identity to the CRC's history than churches at the periphery. It's not because they love their tradition more than the confessions or because they ground their positions in their heritage. It's simply because they're closer to the CRC's center. This proximity necessarily generates two things among these churches. One, an appreciation for institutional history. Because one of the functions of an institution is to preserve history, close proximity to the center of the CRC generates an above-average appreciation for the CRC's cultural and theological history. Now, it's important to mention that in Grand Rapids, you had, again, in the 60s and 70s, the dynamics of white flight. You had the Christian Reformed Church continuing to grow at that period because they're really leaning into the growth curve of the baby boom at that point. So they're planting suburban churches. And a lot of the churches that are in Grand Rapids East that are now being exiled, these churches bit hard on the burning the wooden shoes motif, which creates a real interesting irony to right now. Because they, now suddenly a lot of their families were moving out to Kentwood, moving out to Ada, moving out to Wyoming and Grandville, and moving to all of these places and starting new churches out in the suburbs, which meant that the churches at the core, at the institutional core, Hall and Kalamazoo, when my grandparents were raised, these churches are now starting to wobble. And because they're burning the wooden shoes and because of the racial reconciliation movement, these churches are starting to ask questions about how can we reach out to the community. Most of them really struggled with that. But for example, one of the ways that the Christian Reformed Church used to do missions was their chapel. And so some of these chapels, like Madison Square, the church I went to in college and seminary, they became an organized church, and they effectively reached out to their community. And bit by bit by bit, those CRC core churches reached out to their communities, incorporated African Americans who had moved into these neighborhoods when the Dutch moved out to further suburbs and post-World War II homes and neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of that went on, and that makes this history really nuanced and intricate. A conservative approach to institutional norms, because norms are stronger near the center. Now, this is key, and this is part of my issue with movement conservatism, in that you always have the question of what you're conserving. And so there's a conservatism in the CRC hinterlands that was mobilized by Abide. And those CRC hinterlands often had Dutch immigrants in them, didn't burn the wooden shoes, really loved the confessions. They, for the most part, preserved, now we're going to get into this in a few minutes, they preserved the H.J. Kuyper Christian Reformed Church out in hundreds of rural communities and places. They were the conservative Christian Reformed Church of the H.J. Kuyper era, and even of the pre-H.J. Kuyper era. And they were the conservatives. And so those in the city, in the urban areas, felt themselves to be, we're the ones who are changing. We're the ones who are keeping up with the times. We're the ones who are embracing women in church office. We're the ones who embraced by necessity and by conviction racial reconciliation. We're the ones who are trying to integrate our churches because we know if we don't integrate them, they're not going to be here anymore. And we're also still preserving the buildings. Bate Street, or First CRC on Bate Street in Grand Rapids. Eastern Avenue on Eastern Avenue. And a lot of those churches, it's interesting that a lot of the churches sort of on the second ring, Granville Avenue, CRC, churches out in Wyoming, a lot of those have sort of gone away because of this conservative emphasis. So in one aspect, they're conserving, but what are they conserving? So in one aspect, they're conserving the very ancient because they've got the buildings, as Lyle Shaler called the edifice complex. On the other hand, they're also conserving, as boomers, their own revolutionary movement where they gained power, where they redefined the CRC as they understood it at the institutional core of the denomination. And so that's where these churches that then, in the height of the conflict, 2000, 2001, 2002, started putting affirmation statements on, started making affirmation noises, started adjusting policies. They're saying, we're the true CRC because we hold the institutions. And a lot of the periphery said, no, we're the CRC because we haven't changed. And so you've got both sides in some ways trying to preserve institutions. And so Neeland Avenue, Eastern Avenue, Sherman Street, there's a degree of conservatism that they are working, even as they are trying to change. And they're saying, we are the legacy bearers of the Christian Reformed Church. We are the ones who actually staff the formerly denominational building, Calvin University, Calvin Seminary, Reformed Bible College. They were always more conservative, though, so probably not too many there. Because Reformed Bible College is part of, and when I talk about assimilation in the Christian Reformed Church, Reformed Bible College is part of the Bible College movement. The Bible College movement is one of these tells that shows that while the Christian Reformed Church was still sort of keeping to itself, it would look over its wall and watch the Bible College movement and say, well, we can do some of that. When other churches are sort of going out in the colonial era and they look over the wall and they say foreign missions, they're like, well, we can do some of that. Joanna Veenstra went out there, went a mission in China, and then Rehoboth and Zuni in New Mexico. So the Christian Reformed Church had its walls, but it would look over the walls and see something it liked and sort of bring it in and do its own thing with it. That's what the Christian Reformed Church would do. And so Kent is right that this then we should talk about how the confessions functioned. So here you have Neeland's in local committee saying, we're the tradition, we're the real conservatives here, because we're conserving what the Christian Reformed Church really is. But the people on the periphery saying, you're not what the Christian Reformed Church really is. You've been taking the Christian Reformed Church for the last 20, 30 years. You've been taking the Christian Reformed Church where we haven't wanted to be. You're assimilating into the main line. And those at the center look out and say, you're assimilating into the evangelical, the young, restless, and reformed. So then he talks about the circulatory system, and he had a good blog post on that. Again, you can find that in my videos. In the years leading up to 2010, the CRC circulatory system stopped circulating, and the benefit of being near the center of CRC's institutional network in Grand Rapids became a handicap rather than a strength. I would go to Grand Rapids regularly for board meetings, and it would always be like, wow, I'm living in a different universe in Grand Rapids than I do in Sacramento. Classis Central California is getting further and further and further from Classis Grand Rapids East. It's amazing the distance. And I would joke to people, I would say, the gravity is so thick in Grand Rapids, the gravity is so thick in Grand Rapids that even light can't escape it. It's like a black hole. They can't see the periphery. They can't see it at all, and they don't know what's happening. So 2012, 2013, when I start blogging about this stuff, people are like, but those at the center, they didn't know what they didn't know. And what they didn't know was that with the circulatory system stopped, everything sort of pooled there. And, you know, it's so colonial in some ways. It's like we, the elites of the Christian Reformed Church, really know who we are and what we should do. We hold the sacred tradition because, you know, books like this are published at Erdman's. Come on, it's right there. Erdman's, Baker's, Zondervan. It's the center of the world for the Christian Reformed Church. Since 2010, this has meant two things. One, those at the center continue to rely on institutional ways of getting things done with the outcomes they were expecting, even while those at the periphery began getting things done in a more efficient, effective grassroots way. Exhibit A. Abide and Returning True Church are loose organizations with basically no budget or hierarchy, while Better Together's budget and staff are a lot more than zero. This isn't a good or bad thing, it just reflects historically different ways of getting things done at the center versus the periphery. Well, that's right. If you have to do things on a shoelace, you can. If you're not used to, I remember when Classis Grand Rapids East gave $5,000 out of their mission fund for this thing, and it's like, what? You know, Google's handing out Google Gmail addresses and YouTube channels for free. And WordPress is pretty cheap and Substack is free. So, yeah, that's part of the reason Abide won. Abide And this is where the whole conservative thing sort of breaks down. So Abide are the conservatives, but they weren't stuck in old ways of doing things. Those young millennials, picked up their tools and ran with it. And it was just sort of like this young startup beating IBM or Intel that just can't sort of get out of its own way. Abide was just whoosh, won the race. It was like over before it even started. These two ways of getting things done, one at the center using institutional means and the other at the edges using grassroots, quasi-official, affinity group-centered means, began operating more and more in isolation from one another. I would say no. Abide knows very well. Mary Vandenberg, professor of systematics at Calvin Seminary, is on the Abide leadership team. Now, again, if you go back to my conversation with Aaron Vriesma, I asked, when will Abide end? Well, when our mission is done. Well, what's your mission? Well, basically, defeating same-sex marriage. It's done. Is Abide disbanding? No, it won't. Why? Because once you make something, it's really hard to stop. And the great example of this is, of course, the March of Dimes. Once polio was beaten, guess what? March of Dimes didn't want to die. And so they kept going. They just had to find a new mission. And so the really interesting thing to watch is going to be, okay, you can put up that banner on the carrier, mission accomplished in the CRC, because same-sex marriage is deader than dead in the CRC. It's not happening. Is Abide going to go away? I would say probably not, because once you've sort of created that network, well, that network can be used for a lot of other things. But it was also a coalition, and we'll talk about that. And the question then is, will the coalition hold together, or will there be a fight? If I recall correctly, there were 3 women on the leadership team of Abide. Some would like to see Abide pivot and refight the women in church office war. You got 3 women on your advisory team that I believe are all ordained. I don't think they're going to vote for that. So what happens with Abide is going to be very interesting to watch. But we've known that for a long time. Whether or not people in Abide have known it, I don't know. But someone who is old enough and watching close enough, all of us know that. Okay. In failing to spot the shift since 2010, the CRC left and the CRC right, I don't love left and right, but we'll use them, made a big mistake. The CRC left's mistake has been either accidental ignorance of or purposeful unwillingness to come to terms with the CRC right's rejection of the way of being and doing church near the CRC's institutional center. Now, to the degree left, well, I've been seeing some videos from the Democratic Party. It's like, yeah, I'd say this. I think the CRC left is way more aware that their world ended than the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party can take consolation that Trump will stumble, because he will. And they'll be there to point fingers, but tides have turned. Seas have changed. CRC right's mistake was to confuse Dutch culture identity as a source of belief and practice rather than an unrelated parallel phenomenon that exists solely by virtue of institutional proximity. A proximity that has in other ways served the CRC very well for most of its history. This mistake caused them to make a second mistake in misdiagnosing the causes, sources, and grounds. See, I never heard Abide. I pointed out in my videos the ironies that the burning wooden shoe department is now playing the Dutch race card. That was an irony that I noted because I'm old and I've been watching, and it's like, oh, now the CRC is a family business. In the 70s and 80s, CRC as a family business was racist. Now the CRC as a family business is just about our Dutch heritage, which it's okay to have now, I guess. So I don't think the conservatives ever did that. Now, that became a convenient card for conservatives to play. And it was played. And he mentions 2 of them here. Yeah. So the card was played. I'm in the CRC not because I like Dutch culture, but because I like wooden shoes, but because I love your confessions. I'm not Dutch. I'm more Christian Reformed than Alvin Plantinga. Again, the card was played, but that's never been at the heart of Abide. Abide was created to stop same-sex marriage from going forward in the Christian Reformed Church. And it succeeded. And now we will see what happens to Abide. But that's an interesting irony of what we saw. But it really wasn't what that's about. And I also have to be fair to the confessional side of things. The confessionalist faction in the Christian Reformed Church has long been a minority faction. And Abide, in its mission to stop same-sex marriage in the Christian Reformed Church, found a ready ally in confessionalists and in the confessions, because that was a way that the CRC could stop it. And they used it, and they played the card, and they won with it. But as we're going to continue to see in the next few synods, the confessions have a lot of things in them. Now, to get back into... So right now, in the American political sphere, we're in the first 100 days Trump shock and awe, where Trump's doing this, Trump's doing that. And it's so funny because the most amazing thing I find about people is their amnesia. Trump was president from 2016 to 2020. Did nobody pay attention to his playbook? You know, when he very quickly announced 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, everybody's freaking the heck out. Well, what did he do with that? Well, it's a very smart negotiating tactic. He forced the Canadians and the Mexicans to pick up the phone and say, "Can we make a deal?" And Trump's like, "I'm all about deals. Deals are us. So let's suspend that sucker for a month and we'll make a deal." I mean, NAFTA, remember that whole thing? I mean, this Donald Trump, we know who the guy is, okay? We know who he is. So this happened. Now what you see in the news, however, as we continue to go deeper away from, say, monolithic news sources into all these tiny little news sources, that both sides in the middle of the information war in the first 100 days of Trump shock and awe are this over here, this over here, this over here, this over here. These are all the Democratic talking points. Trump did this, Trump did this, Trump did this, Trump did this, Trump did this. And the others are like, here, 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 here. Well, what does that mean? This is the epistemic revolution. This is the age of the death of facts that I talk about. And on the video I released today, my conversation with Spencer Clavin, that's basically what this is about. That you don't just see the world. There's way more information out there, and what you do is you filter it through and you create a narrative and you act out of that narrative. And so basically in the Christian Reformed Church, there were two separate narratives going on. And I think what Kent nicely shows is, well, those narratives were well underway. And the difficulty that the CRC establishment had was increasingly they didn't understand about the circulatory system. They didn't understand just how they were selecting the people that they were attracting to themselves. And then in the course of the circulatory system died, started dying in like the 90s and aughts. When that circulatory system was dying, then the inbreeding in Grand Rapids, I don't mean that biologically, I mean that in terms of their thought, just compounded. So the Grand Rapids Christian Reformed Church got further and further and further from the peripheries, and what Abide was able to do was create a coalition from the periphery that was powerful enough to basically knock the establishment over and displace it. So it isn't an either or, and it isn't Dutch heritage versus confessions. CRC liked confessions, but CRC's appropriation of confessions was often, and has been for decades, selective. And you can find that by finding places that, let's say, are, really, really hammering the 5 points of Calvinism found in the Canons of Dort, and other places that just sort of avoid them. Now, the establishment in Calvin College would keep talking about the 2 books of the Belgic Confession, and other places would just sort of act like fundamentalists. And this is where, again, these labels of conservative and progressive don't really fit, because in terms of strategy and tactics, Abide were tremendously innovative and progressive. They embraced the internet and its tools, and they used it to defeat the institutional establishment. The establishment was conservative in that this is the way we work. And so then when they saw that basically Abide's asymmetric warfare completely disabled the establishment's advantages, the establishment didn't know what to do, and they still don't know what to do. And it'll be very interesting to see what they do. But here's the thing. What they do is going to be like establishment thinking. And when I talk to people in the establishment, I say, boy, you've got an amazing opportunity to really do something new. I'm talking as a periphery guy who's been used to working on a shoestring, who paid the precious price of free for my Gmail address and my YouTube channel. So when I look at them and say, you've got one heck of an opportunity, I don't even know to what degree they see it. Because what they sort of want to do is rebuild the institution that they've lost. Maybe, I don't know. It was very interesting, of course, because when they fought the new war, which was the same-sex marriage war, they tried to fight it like the old war, which was the women in office war, and they lost. So, yeah. So it isn't, he's right in that it really isn't Dutch culture versus confessions, because both the Dutch culture and the confessions, quite frankly, aren't what's at the heart of it. They are 2 different cultures, and one won and the other lost. Now, if you want to get a taste for the culture that won, you can look at, there's a podcast in Substack, and I'll put the links below, called The Messy Reformation. And I listened to the first one. I thought it was Jason Ruiz, and he said it's Jason Rice. And I thought, well, this is the funny thing about diversity in language, because you see a name like Ruiz, and it's not Vander Ruiz or not Vander Ruizma or Luis or Ruistra. There's obviously some Hispanic heritage back in there someplace, but he released it. He has a 2-part. It's podcast. See this again. They're doing it smart. They're doing it right. They've got the podcast, they've got the YouTube, and they've got the Substack. Are they conservative? They're not even bothering to pay attention to the banner. So I don't follow this closely, but episode 1 of the State of CRC 2024, some people heard this, contacted me and said, oh. Now, and I think it was all within the resonance of the Trump shock and awe, which really has bothered some people, and other people are really celebrating because of it. And so he's talking about the denomination, and basically, I wonder if AI wrote this. I don't know. It would be you can drop your transcript into one of these AI engines and have it write a summary, and that could very much be that. Maybe I'll do that with my Substack. Maybe I'll have my Substack summarize my videos and post it on my Substack. That's not a bad idea. I know some of you will hate me for it, but if you're a busy pastor who's got a church and you're doing all these other things too, dropping it into AI and having them write a summary, no spell checking and none of that, even though Yeah, it's not terribly inspired writing, but it's content. Jason then focused on the areas needing improvement. Denominational staff really need to focus on restoring trust in the denomination. Yeah, that's true. Classes, but then, see, I'll give you the gist of it. I wrote a piece, and I should probably pull up that piece too. Hang on. This was not written by AI. This was written by me. A few takeaways from the messy Reformation. I posted this on CRC Voices. Number one, clearly there's a transition underway in the denomination, and a degree of real gravity is being felt all around. Denominational employees adjusting to the readjustment of who the CRC is in terms of low-resolution view. It's a correction, in my opinion, more conservative, less urban, influenced by emerging church splinter of the young, restless, and reform movement. A younger boomer generation is taking charge. A younger generation is taking charge. Millennials are displacing boomers in leadership. Hard not to feel the impact of Trump executive order vibes in this, but without power. It's a new day, a new sheriff. The signs are on the wall of the saloon and the livery stable. But there's nobody in the CRC that has the kind of power that the POTUS has with his executive orders, to whatever degree the executive orders have power. Point 3, discerning the body of abide. He's right. That's Rice. I have a hard time saying Rice. Rice is on the right side of it. And I mean on the right wing of it. And still many don't understand that whatever abide is, and however long it lasted, it wasn't just its right that won. This will make the upcoming sentence interesting. Young, restless, and reformed millennials are often far more capable at adopting the boomer therapy speak they were raised in. How will this play out when it comes to decisions made in offices of power? We'll see. Will the coalition that had the votes in 2022 to 2024 hold together when other issues begin to present themselves? Competence. He made the issue of competency in that podcast. I'll put the links to the podcast below and you can listen to them. This, of course, will be a great, this, of course, is the big question of Trump 2.0. Yes, we know you're able and willing to break things, but can you put them back together in the promised great again way that you've been pitching? Competence gets mentioned here. We'll see. Governing is far harder than mounting a revolution. 5, realities of church ministry in North America and winning in a declining market. It's one thing to win synod because the kids of the boomers you're voting out have all left the church. It's another to actually do evangelism, make disciples, run churches, especially at a time when overall your numbers are not what they were in the 60s to 80s. Evangelicalism succeeded partially because it had the main line to cannibalize, and the Roman Catholic Church. That carcass is spent, and we are doing ministry in a negative world. Donald Trump is our first post-Christian president. Billy Graham is dead, and the spiritual advisors of Donald Trump are not the sort of people young, restless, and reformed types can easily cozy up with. While young, restless, and reformed churches can do evangelism, they're probably between the mainline and the Pentecostals in terms of potency. They've even going a bit below the trad cats and the orthobros. Will they play the metagelical game, or is it a better strategy to pound hard on bright lines and the current cultural appetite for rigor? Even Mark Driscoll abandoned the young, restless, and reformed vibe and set off in the independent Pentecostal territory. Say what you want about his character, but he does have a nose for what's hot at the moment. Driscoll does. The 20th century CRC is gone, and the CRC is now fully at the mercy of Christian market forces, which will increasingly shape the CRC along the lines of other North American denominations. Should it try to compete with the PCA, Protestant Church of America, for young, restless, and reformed hegemony? Can't do it. It will never be that pure or hopefully that prone to conflict. We live in interesting times. So I wrote that a few days ago, and then I wrote this. Number 1, the CRC has been evolving and changing since it broke away from the RCA. There are a variety of books on Christian Reformed Church history. One that I've been reading more recently is a book by my old history professor at Calvin Seminary, Reformed Thought and the Experience in a New World. Some of those early chapters where he writes about what the experience was of Dutch immigrants at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century before the First World War. The breakaway from the Reformed Church of America over lodge memberships, but again, that's a broader Christian issue, not just the Christian Reformed Church. English language, they didn't like it. They wanted to keep doing their thing in Dutch. And singing hymns. Now, similar to the confessions and how the confessions have functioned in this present church fight, I think some of those other issues, and let's say the CRC from 1856 to 1914, the CRC had those issues function in similar ways. They could feel they were not on the same page as the Reformed Church in America that had been in the New World for hundreds of years. They could feel the difference. And the thing is, when you feel the difference, that filtering effect goes looking for reasons, and lodge membership, English language, hymn singing versus psalm singing. So the Christian Reformed Church from 1856 to 1914 was pretty much a hodgepodge. They were against the RCA. They wanted to do their own thing. They were sort of huddled together, immigrants fresh off the boat. 1914, beginning of the First World War, Dutch is able to maintain its neutrality, but immigration pretty much stopped. The North Atlantic was a dangerous place. Immigration stopped. The Great Migration of African Americans up from the Jim Crow South began migrating up into the rest of the United States, escaping Jim Crow apartheid, and things continue to change. But that wave of immigrants up until the First World War, they're now settling in America. Their children, my grandfather's generation, are born in America, or maybe were infants in the Netherlands and came over. My grandfather was born in America. My other grandfather, I think he was born in the Netherlands and came over when he was 1 or 2, something like that. So that generation, my grandparents' generation, born around between 1900 and 1914, they are the ones that are going to they're going to be the ones who come into power during the Second World War. Okay? So my grandfather goes to seminary, starts his ministry in the 1920s, and ministers into the 1970s. Okay? That's my grandfather's generation. That generation was dominated by the vision of this man, Henry Kuiper, H.J. Kuiper. He led a revolution, again, a conservative revolution, because in the United States, there were a lot of, other modernist ideas coming, but the Christian Reformed Church was going to be conservative. H.J. Kuiper pioneered the institutional foundations of my grandparents' generation in the Christian Reformed Church, those born before the First World War. And those institutional foundations were standardized liturgy, integration of hymns in worship, Christian education, and community cohesion through publications and the printing press. The H.J. Kuiper era was also a revolution. So the concerns of the pre-World War I church, lodge membership, hymn singing, English language. The First World War, the Christian Reformed Church starts adopting English all over the place. And H.J. Kuiper is right on that front line. English language. Banner becomes the English language banner, not the Dutch version. The English language banner becomes the network through which the CRC worked. The Christian schools become the network through which the Christian Reformed circulatory system functions. Now, after the First World War, the automobile is invented. After the Second World War, the interstates are invented. The Christian Reformed Church is using all of that new technology. Radio ministry comes online, the Back to God Hour. Generally speaking, what happened in the Christian Reformed Church was that pioneers would try something and the rest of the community would watch and they'd say, well, there are people, let's just adopt that. So radio ministry becomes the Back to God Hour. Johanna Veenstra's ministry becomes Christian Reformed World Missions. Ministry in Zuni, New Mexico becomes Home Missions. And so the Christian Reformed Church basically adopts things that some of its innovators are doing and makes it theirs institutionally centralized in Grand Rapids. You know, Palos Heights in Chicago were Back to God. They never really left there. But again, that was the pattern. That was very much the pattern of that generation of my grandparents' years who were born before the First World War. That was how they did business. That's how institutionals run. You would buy a big building. You would fill it with offices, with typewriters. You would have your own printing press. You would have telephones. And you would have, well, let me see if I can find that picture that I took out of one of the yearbooks. This is the mid-century vision. I forget what year I took this out. Clearly a hand-drawn map of the United States. Someone probably put paper over a map and sort of traced it. You see some of the borders are a little wonky, but this is in the official denominational handbook. But look at this picture and look at the title. Map showing, written by hand here. Map showing distribution of our churches in North America. Now, they could have showed this distribution in a lot of different ways, but here it is, okay? The map speaks for itself. And there's Massachusetts, there's Whitensville. Boy, they really butchered New Jersey. Here's New Jersey. Here's Southern California. Here's Ripon. Oh, that's probably Hanford. There's Ripon. There's Alameda. You got to put that a little bit further out. Sacramento churches weren't around there. Here's Washington. Poor Canada. Always the red-haired stepchild of the CRC. Oh, gosh. 2 dots. Canada. America's hat. America's 51st state. Here we are. They get 2 dots. But, Syracuse, Rochester, nothing in the UP, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Iowa. I mean, this map says it all. This is the perspective of when my grandparents' generation were at the peak of their power in the middle of the 20th century in the Christian Reformed Church. H.J. Kuyper's Christian Reformed Church. The English Language Weekly magazine overtook the Dutch version. The denominational educational institutions found their footing in American soil. Christian day schools, Calvin College, Calvin Seminary, other schools too. Liturgy was standardized and popularized, including hymn singing, a revolutionary innovation departing from one of the main reasons of splitting from the RCA. There was a broad consensus of mission. How different we were from the other similarly immigrant churches was highly debatable, but it was confessional. And so you hammered those points. And again, in H.J. Kuyper's world, the big threat was Methodism. Beware the Methodists. Communists, of course, but we could all agree on the communists. But the evangelicals, maybe I'll go to the evangelicals, but I'm going to keep my eye on those Methodists. Catholics, Orthodox are just non-existent. Catholics, yeah, we all know about those papists. We got that straight back in the Reformation period. So that's the world of H.J. Kuyper. How each were working on a assimilation process of Americanization with their own doctrinal, cultural particulars. All those immigrant churches were doing similar things, parallel to the CRC. But the assimilation process was happening to all of them because the medium is the message and we're using all of the mediums. So we're going to try and keep our doctrine pure. Now, again, when you get to the Seeker movement basically said, and I touched this in the emergent videos, the emergent church videos, we're going to keep, you can take, it's basically a package approach. You can have your CRC package or your Methodist package or your Baptist package. And what the church growth movement said is, this is like this little add-on. We can show you how to do mailings. We can show you how to use all that Jesus people music and modern music and stuff. We can show you how to tweak your church to the radio dial, but the message stays the same. Well, the emergent church comes along and says, can it? Really? Did it? Not really. Bill, one of the Bills on Voices, posted a nice piece about the post-war years, especially accelerating in the late 60s when the counterculture. This deeply impacts, of course, the baby boomers. That's their revolution, their defining moment. For some of them, now remember, a lot of baby boomers never really did the counterculture thing. The counterculture gets all the press. And there's a great YouTube channel, I forget the name of it, guy who lived through a lot of it, has a lot of videos about it. And so if you look at a closer history of the 60s, and this is something that Marsden in the Twilight of the American Enlightenment leans into. There's a great book by George Marsden. When the issues of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, everything was sort of put on hold first by the Second World War and then by the urgency of the Cold War. But then by the time of Vietnam and Watergate, you just can't keep a lid on these things and everything just busts open. And it deeply impacts the church. And of course, before that, the civil rights movement deeply impacts the church, and I've made plenty of videos about that. How in the CRC? Now, this is key. And this is where, it's not a Dutch versus confessional thing. The CRC has always been really about family. The strong familial and cultural cohesion that kept the CRC, that helped the CRC survive the Depression and the war years, kept it from blowing apart in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These were family members. Ideas are starting to converge, but they were family. And the CRC was a family thing. So we keep the family together. CRC families were strong, and love was durable and multi-generational. You can hear this in Rita's cry. Maybe I'll have to put that in here.
Then Herb, and then Matt from Lake Erie.
Rita Klein-Gelting, classes Quinty. I have a question for the majority committee, and I think I know the answer. Actually, 4 questions, but I know the answer, but because otherwise I wouldn't have signed the minority report. If this passes, can someone who is unsure of what God expects of LGBTQ peoples, can that unsure person become a member of the CRC? Question 2, can someone who is unsure become an office bearer in the Christian Reformed Church, in our churches? Number 3, can someone who is unsure sign a gravamen? Is that okay? I've been a member of the Christian Reformed Church all my life, as my husband and our parents and my 4 sons, my 4 boys, who are, Karen knows they're men, and their wives are all following Jesus and are members of the Christian Reformed Church. My 12 grandchildren are members of the Christian Reformed Church. If my 4 sons and their wives fall into this category of unsure, can the CRC still be their home? You may answer the question.
No, I know. No, Rita, that's fine. We were in committee together. I bless you. We worked together. I'll try and answer as best I can. Maybe not so much in the technical manner of things.
Come to order, folks. Give some space here. Give some space.
At 5:30 this evening, we adjourned think it was 5:35, and I jumped in my vehicle and I drove to a sports bar down the street, had ice water with lemon. And here I am, a 55-year-old guy sitting in the corner in a sweater, crying. I love this church. I've been a member all my life. I love preaching for this church. I love teaching in this church. I love its confessions. I wouldn't be standing here tonight if I didn't love these confessions. But what griefs me so bad is that we make decisions here and that we leave here and some decide to be ogres about it, jerks about it. And we can't even hold to a confession. We gotta be jerks about it. Please, so Rita, I hear your heart. Yes, Willem, it is a yes and no question. No. Let me try and put it this way. And if I'm out of order, say so. If you're going to vote for this majority report, please don't leave here and be a jerk about it. And to those who are opposed to this report, not all of us hate LGBT people. Okay? Sorry. I'm sorry. So, yes, I want to believe, Rita, those who have questions, who are unsure, have a place. And we're not jerks about it, and we can find a way to converse. But please understand, I love these confessions. If we could do this, we could hold the truth and bring people along in the truth, and they can see Christ in us. I don't know, I realize that probably doesn't specifically answer your question. I'm just speaking to the heart of what we're trying to talk about here. So I apologize.
We have Matthew, then we have John.
The genius of the post-war generation was to not let the powerful forces within the modernist fundamentalist tension blow us apart. The peak of this was probably the Women in Church Office War, where we opted for unity over purity. Most of us could agree to disagree over whether or not our women, our moms, our daughters, our wives, our friends would be accepted in church leadership. They were still our people. We trusted them. Now, I know that's going to pinch for some of you, I know, because I know exactly where your mind went. Even with what feels like a strong turn to the right, I don't know that the CRC will undo this. It's already deeply baked into our institutions. Whoops. The CRC did hold within itself the bifurcating tensions of that modernist fundamentalist war. And it's currently trying to work that out. It evolved two factions, and I think Kent nicely, these are the two realities. You sort of had the institutional core, and then the periphery that was sort of brought into a coalition using contemporary tools, of the internet with Abide. It evolved two factions, at least, but they could coalesce to fight this war. It evolved two factions, and what the same-sex marriage wars did was to fork the modernist faction. Same-sex marriage is not the same issue as women in church office, despite how both are fruits of the modernist impulse. As Dan noted, Abide, Dan on CRC Voices, became the vehicle of coalition, where the conservative coalitions, confessionalists and fundamentalists, could bond with elements of moderate modernists, women leaders in particular, to create the 70-30 majorities that drew the line about same-sex marriage in the CRC. In the Women in Church Office Wars, the CRC calved off one edge of its fundamentalist wing. Same-sex marriage wars did so similarly to the left. We'll see if the numbers on the same-sex marriage exile will equal the numbers on the Women in Church Office departures. I doubt it. I think the split, well, the CRC itself is smaller. Again, generally speaking, churches split right and leak left. That left has been leaking for a long time, so it's probably not going to be as large. My guess is no. Same-sex marriage exile numbers are smaller because many who would have been their partners deconstructed no longer church. This children of the boomers, basically, who no longer go to church. They weren't there for their votes. They're not going to be there for their boomer parents' adaptive churches either. They'd be like, "Yeah, mom, dad, good on you. Way to, stand up to those bigots. Well, now that we have a rainbow flag, will you come back to church? Why would I do that?" And that's the question you have to answer. Why would I do that? If you don't answer that question, you don't have a church. The CRC already entered into a new era. And usually when you have these fights, there's this economist thing that when the tide goes out, you get to see who's swimming naked. Well, the idea of that is basically when you have this fight, now suddenly we see how much the Christian Reformed Church changed from 1995 to 2020. In those 25 years, it changed a lot. But those in the institution, in the middle, couldn't see it. They were thinking along the lines of their allies out in the main line, and everybody else is saying, "You really want to do what the main line is doing?" We've been looking at their numbers. Not so great. In fact, catastrophic. But hey, you do you. Which is, again, sort of what the Abide Coalition said to the establishment. Hey, you do you. We're just not going there. And by the way, we got more votes than you. So if you want to do you, you'll have to start a new you. And that, of course, because the dynamics that Kent showed, that's crushing. Because that was their conservatism. Okay. CRC has already entered a new era. American assimilation is almost complete. The old familial and cultural unifiers that made the CRC handle money differently. CRC collectively had their covenant. That's the language they used on that. We covenant together so that kids can go to Christian school. We covenant together so that foreign missionaries can just go out and do mission. They don't have to do fundraising. We covenant together to do all of that. It's going away. In the same-sex marriage wars, we are now an evangelical denominations whose pull to the main line is exiled away. CRC particularities will continue to evaporate, only held back by institutions like Christian day schools that have longer to assimilate, and most of the Christian day school network has already assimilated beyond the Christian Reformed Church because of institutional survival. But part of Jason Rice, I'll say Rice, he said Rice, maybe I'm getting that wrong, I don't know, Jason Rice's point, well, you break it, you own it. And they broke the establishment, and now they are, well, a new establishment is yet to emerge. I'll say it that way. So the tensions in American systems are ours. Jason now feels a degree of ownership and can worry about the store more than the fight. And that's exactly where Abide is going to get interesting. The CRC, as with all similar churches, has a leadership crisis. It's seen in the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox, it's long been with the Protestant churches. Fewer and fewer resources for training and supporting clergy. What you see in the Christian Reformed Church is that increasingly Christian Reformed churches are smaller. They're having bivocational clergy. They're having clergy trained in Bible college and other seminaries. The CRC is trying to hold that line, but it's going to lose because the resources aren't there. The way the CRC used to manage money, it's not there anymore. And that was a piece of my grandfather's and my father's church. Number two, the CRC has a growth crisis. The real crisis of the CRC is not women in office, never has been. The real crisis of the CRC is the end of the baby boom, de-churching of America, ongoing change in the religious imaginary of the country, and fewer people going to church, and the Christian Reformed Church not competing with other Christian denominations in North America. That's the crisis of the church. The deconstruction of the boomers' kids. Answering the question, oh, we're flying the rainbow flag. Won't you come to church? Why would I do that? That's the question. Why would I go to your church? Your music isn't as good as what I can get on Spotify. Your talks aren't as good as the TED Talks. Some of the things I'm real passionate about, my environmentalism, my anti-Trumpism, my LGBT, all of those things, even if you've got that little flag out, everybody knows those are political battles. You know, the main line, they're all there. The main line is just sort of a weird group that has a particular taste for a weird kind of distraction and amusement. Now, that's harsh. I get it. And it's not that bad. I get that too. But in the minds of people who are not going to church, that's what they think. So the CRC, as with all churches, is a leadership crisis. Two, the CRC has a growth crisis. While classical and denominational policy issues, confessionality is increasingly a policy issue. The deeper crisis is at the local level. What sorts of economies of scale can the local churches create in order to fund classical and denominational agendas and visions? It's interesting that Jason, in the second part of the thing, I haven't listened to the whole thing yet, but I listened to part of it, talks about basically defunding the denominational coffers and strengthening the classical coffers. Pete Horta tried to do that a number of years ago with regional and try to basically calve California off from the rest of the denomination, and all of that sweet ministry share money that was going to Grand Rapids gets stopped in California, and then Peter was basically pushing much more of a seeker agenda. We could do church planting with all of that money in California because California generates a lot of money. When the politicians go to California, they don't look for votes, they look for money. To a degree, same in the Christian Reformed Church. So, and for a very long time, have said that classis is in many ways sort of the key assembly in the Christian Reformed Church. And classes are weak. And classes are weak for good reasons beyond just funding. Because classes, what the denomination did in the H.J. Kuyper years, which was institutionalize, along with the rest of America during the Second World War, institutionalize, there's big reluctance to do that at the classical level. Very few classes in the CRC have full-time employees. Never mind established offices to run things. You know, I should probably talk to Jason. It's going to have to be March or later, though, because February's booked. But CRC has a local problem and has a classical problem. And the denomination, Jason is right, is going to quickly wither away for multiple reasons. What sorts of economies of scale can the local churches create in order to fund classical and denominational agendas and vision? All indications are that the CRC particularity, committed, widespread, large, grassroots, unified support for denominational vision, is ending, and the CRC will downsize at the levels to be more in keeping with the denominational size. Jason might take a meme from Donald Trump in terms of, the shock and awe, but the reality at both levels is true. The USA is nearly broke and must downsize its borrowed largesse, and the CRC can no longer afford how it's done business since the 1970s. The CRC has a heavy superstructure. It's shedding it. It's been shedding it quickly for the last 10 years, and that process will continue until it figures out how to right size itself. But that's going to be very painful. And so, in other words, basically, nothing but pain coming to Grand Rapids unless they can really do their job well and think differently. But part of what I really got from Kent's piece was that thinking differently is going to be really hard for them, just like it's really hard for the Democratic National Convention. It's really hard. Now, Dan W., now a person on Voice, Dan W.'s conservative leadership, so he wrote a post that was basically, when are we going to see Christian Reformed leaders, the kind of people we want to see, conservative, confessional. But here's the thing again about confessionality. Dan W.'s vision of confessional centrality, I don't know that it's Jason's. I don't know that it's Mo's, because that's where the confessional conversations really get crunchy. Because someone might say, I think it's all about sexuality. And another one might say, I think it's all about divine election. Another one might say, I think it's all about covenant, infant baptism. Infant baptism is going to be one of the next big fights in the CRC. Because where same-sex marriage split the modernist coalition, infant baptism is going to split the fundamentalist coalition. So Dan W.'s conservative leadership at the denominational level is a project that will take years to achieve if it happens at all. There's always a delay at that level. Many boomers here remember the leadership inherited from my grandfather's generation. From the H.J. Kuiper generation, as the old men at the top were slow to change. They did change for their kids eventually, and the boomer kids eventually took power. That transition is underway with a few Xers, but mostly millennials will come to power. The last few synods saw the ascendancy of a kinder, gentler conservative who wielded boomer therapy speak with ease. Just look how... Paul DeVries is 1 year older than me, so very young boomer, not quite Xer. And then look at, what was his name? I forget his name. Look at the synod's president at the last synod. Could do the therapy speak. We're all about the emotions. You're going to have emotions. It's okay. Emotions are neither right nor wrong, but in the end, the votes are going to count. We're going to pad it as much as we can. That's millennial talk. H.J. Kuiper's generation. I'm old enough to remember them. No. He did not do the therapy talk. That, again, is where conservatives aren't as conservative as they think they are. And progressives are conservatives in their own way. They're trying to conserve something else, usually in their own makeup. The current denominational leadership was mostly hired pre-2022. In fact, Synod 2022, Zach King, I interviewed him at Synod 22. You can find it. Some of them have been able to adapt. Part of Abide was simply to replace already neglected modernist institutions like the Banner. If the banner survives, the next editor will be a millennial man, likely from America and likely sharing more evangelical and young, restless, and reformed type pieces than have been seen for the last few decades. If you look at some things, if the banner lives, the next editor will probably be a complementarian. We haven't had a complementarian banner editor. Who took over from H.J. Kuyper? Kuyvenhoven, I think pro-women in office. But Kuyvenhoven was a Dutch immigrant. There's another wrinkle. Those post-World War II Dutch immigrants were different people from my great-grandparents' generation. They left a different Netherlands. They were deeply institutional, but they could much more easily embrace a lot of the modernist ideas. So think more Gospel Coalition than Christian Century. Zach King clearly wants to pivot attention to the worldwide emphasis. Now, I've been beaten up on this pretty bad in voices. Clearly wants to pivot attention from worldwide emphasis, which gets some play among CRC confessionalists. Most of the churches incorporated into classes. Now, even there, we're trying to grow the CRC by, we're not going to send foreign missionaries out from a central mission organization. We're going to have classes incorporate churches from other countries into their classes. I could make a whole video on my thoughts on that one. I don't know if I will. They will be male-led, these churches in other nations. They will be male-led, ostensibly confessionally reformed, and make fundamentalist and biblicist noises. None of this will surprise anyone who's done CRC missionary work overseas. What these classes are unprepared for are the ranges of other cultural issues that will emerge. You just wait until one of those things blows up bad, and it's going to happen. There's no way it's not going to happen. It's just culture. In my opinion, as a leadership strategy, this is at best a distraction and at worst a move that siphons off increasingly precious resources, classical attention, funding, energy, away from the true crisis of the CRC, the decline of the local church. This decline, the CRC has been attempting to address through successive assimilation programs, but for the most part failing. Now let's talk about the history of the CRC and missiology. First CRC missiological program was very grassroots. It was the chapel. The chapel was a pre-World War II way that slowly, basically it was killed by the racial reconciliation movement, because the racial reconciliation movement would look and say, well, chapels are sort of second-class institutions, and that sort of smells like apartheid, Jim Crow. So no more chapels. Everything's a church. But now we have emerging churches and established churches. No more chapels. The CRC in the 1980s, as it was intuitively feeling the end of the H.J. Kuyper era, tried both mainline and evangelical strategies at the same time. I'd say back to the 60s and 50s. Cultural evolution, I thought of that after I wrote that sentence, so I should change it, but I won't. Cultural evolution adoption along liberationist lines. That was a lot of the getting up to speed. There was a lot of the getting up to speed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's why the wooden shoes got burned. Cultural evolution, assimilation. Adoption along liberationist lines. Ethnic diversity, women, LGBT were part of the CRC package from the liberationist years, and the CRC had some success with it. This is part of the institutional package. So when Abide came and won the war, the establishment just had no clue what to do. It just had no clue what to do, because, and that's why you heard all this language of they've stolen our church. That was a very conservative message. Our church. They're changing our church. We had a vision for what our church was to become. And again, that vision, not unlike the Democratic Party's vision. A few decades late, but that's sort of the mainline vision. They're all connected. differences too, of course, but it's the basic trajectory. This helps blunt deconstruction losses in the 70s and 80s. Some emergent vibes in the 90s and aughts, but the emergent church ground to a halt. See Richard Beck's blog posts and my videos about the emergent church. That's how they fit into this piece. Point 2. The CRC tried evangelical missions from modernist gospel methods. Evangelism Explosion, D. James Kennedy. That was evangelicalism. Okay, that was Billy Graham and evangelicalism. And at some point, CRC churches might send groups to the crusade and then maybe try to enfold people from the crusade. But again, the Billy Graham crusades had the taint of Methodism on them still. So 80s and 90s, evangelism explosion. I remember when I went to the mission field, we had our CRC world, we had our CRC world missions orientation in the denomination, and I was taught D. James Kennedy evangelism explosion. This is how you make Christians. And I remember being there thinking, really? This is going to work in the Dominican Republic? Actually, probably would have, because latent civilizational Christianity in the Dominican Republic with the threat of hell, that's a very real thing in terms of the Catholic, the practicing Catholics, the nominal Catholics, and the evangelicals. So, but I didn't know the Dominican Republic yet. I knew North America, and I thought, I don't think that's going to work. But evangelism explosion moved on to Willow Creek and the megachurches and a safe place to hear a dangerous message and Saddleback's baseball diamond, and the core of the gospel stays the same. We just change the embroidery around it. CRC tried that, some success, never like the big churches. Again, it just didn't quite fit with everything. But then, of course, Tim Keller does something the CRC is more like, that's what we can do, except we couldn't quite duplicate Tim Keller. So you can lose your hair, just can't necessarily preach like him. And I know some of you don't like Tim Keller too. I get it. Leave your comments below. Most didn't work that well for us. Recently, the Young, Restless, and Reformed has been moderately successful at attracting young leaders, but it, of course, accelerated the tensions listed above and provoked the same-sex marriage split. The same-sex marriage war's victors continue to reign over a declining market. It's too early to know if the larger market is turning from negative world into what? It's going to be super interesting, because I think Aaron Wright is positive, neutral, negative, but what's beyond negative? I don't think we have any idea. But if the CRC wants to go into the future, local churches need to grow, and not just in rural and agricultural areas where the CRC is better holding its own than in urban areas. Urbanization isn't going away, and as long as cities are culture creators and economic magnets, CRC are going to have to figure out how to live and grow with them. And this is probably the biggest crisis that the winners of this war face. That, okay, well, where's Jason? He's in he's someplace in Wisconsin. I don't remember where. So what's the CRC going to do? Can the CRC, most of the CRC losses, first, the losses were left leaking. And I've been singing the song for a long time. New Jersey, Chicago, Toronto, San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California. CRC has been losing churches that are in the urban areas for a long time. The last remaining bastion of urban CRC churches is that core that are now exiling. And that's why again, I say things to people that people don't understand, but I say to the people who are exiled, there's a blessing in here for y'all. And I'm really excited to see what you do with it. But Grand Rapids is a modern American city. It is not New York. It is not Chicago. It is not San Francisco. It is not Los Angeles. It is not Seattle. It is not Vancouver. It is not Toronto. Tim Keller, part of the reason caught the imagination of many in the CRC was it's New York. But the question is, post Tim Keller, what's happening at Redeemer? And the other is that a part of Tim Keller's growth came because of Rudy Giuliani. Just think about that. Because New York changed in the 80s and 90s. The A-Beam, Warriors, New York blackout riots, Friends, Sex in the City, and Tim Keller was able to cut out a niche in there. But Tim Keller was able to cut out a niche in there. Tim Keller was an extraordinary leader. Tim Keller is dead. Will the PCA continue to be able to do that? Some PCA leadership in Tim Keller's line, and really the missional line, went emergent. And again, the story of the emergent church wasn't really so well. Where will this metagelical wave go? I don't know. If you want to see what I mean by metagelical, see some of the previous videos. So, the CRC has an urban crisis. And fighting between ourselves isn't going to help. The same-sex marriage awards demonstrated that the CRC has lost cities. It's exiling its last significant urban enclave and will become culturally lagging church unless it figures this out. Conservatives are feeling flush right now, but have a crisis of their own. While the Dems have zero ideas where the future lies for them, conservatives have yet to see if J.D. Vance is the future. One of the competing videos today was to talk more about J.D. Vance and his video, his conversation about ordered loves. Because some of that has been covered by Bethel. I watched Luke and the Corner cover it to a degree, but there's some more angles to dig into that. It's super metagelical. It's super metagelical, but we've got to deal with movement conservatism versus progressive liberationism, because that's really where a lot of that is. And we have to deal with what on earth do we mean by Christian nationalism and Christian internationalism? So Vance's trad-cath religion is not incidental to any of this at this point. It is where the emergent movement has led. Unlike the 1990s, when the boomers thought they had won the future, now the 2020s, nobody has any idea what the future looks like. Now, the conservatives are running their victory laps. But I don't really think the conservatives have any idea about the future. And I don't think they're even paying much attention to it. They're just happy to have won the war. Now, the war in the CRC is won. In Washington, that's just endless war. The conservative banner carrier is a boomer who is a third marriage serial womanizer who maybe is too old to get into trouble again. Maybe. We'll see. 2, despite the hype around executive orders against DEI and transing kids, he softened his stance on abortion. He's probably paid for a few. 3, this particular boomer holds no reasonable hope to bring any of the sort of economic austerity to address the looming U.S. debt crisis. Donald Trump in his first term was a regular Republican that passed deep tax cuts that drove up the deficit. And then, of course, during COVID, the deficit got worse by the Democrats. And I don't think tariffs are going to be the answer to the deficit. We're not 100 days in, and we're already backing off tariffs from Canada and Mexico. And I think we'll continue to see tariffs with China, but none of us knows what's going to happen in China or even what's happening now in China. So tariffs are not going to fix the U.S. deficit. Neither are tax cuts. The U.S. has a real deficit issue, My guess. What do I know? I'm not an economist. Just my hunch. Conservatives have surrounded themselves with a bunch of transhumanists who want to create AI machines, jack the internet into our brains, and colonize Mars. Not exactly conservative thoughts. In other words, the conservative coalition that beat Biden and Harris, they got plenty of cracks in there too, just like the Abide coalition does. At least they have a vision for the future, but it doesn't sound terribly conservative. And much of it not terribly Christian. Bay Area religion has gotten a lot weirder in the last 20 years beyond just the standard New Age stuff. Lewis's That Hideous Strength is popular now for a reason. The CRC's future, because again, so Dreer loves Vance and he knows him personally, so who knows? But how long term will Vance and Musk get along? Remember, again, people forget everything. Musk was there at the first term, right? And had his falling out with Donald Trump within the first 100 days. Now, Musk has a lot more influence. Maybe he'll hang in there, but Trump wants to cut all those EV tax credits. Guess who benefits a ton from those EV tax credits and continues to make sure that their vehicles qualify for those tax credits? You say, oh, our leaders won't be so mercenary, and yeah, don't bet on it. This is politics, my friend. Politics and money, they go like this. CRC's future might be a backwater, moderately conservative reform denomination that is going to successively decline, mostly in rural areas from which much of it sprang. Is that okay with the new, kinder, gentler male millennial leadership? Ruiz clearly wants more vision. And it was very interesting at the beginning of the second podcast. It's like, we need to just have focus on the one thing. And I was thinking, okay, well, I long ago heard John Rosaboom talk about keep the one thing the main, Jason Rice, that's how they think. Keep the one, Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. Keep the main thing the one thing. But that was John Rosaboom, modernist, conversionist, hell avoidant, mid-century evangelicalism. When you're a father, what's the one thing? Usually the one thing is whatever the crisis is now. Getting money for college, making sure food's on the table, keeping my job, keeping health insurance, fixing the car. When it comes to real life, there's a lot of things that grab up and take your attention. And so right now, the CRC is basically following a young, restless, and reformed light for some of them, but there's tensions even within the conservative coalitions, and there's going to be big tensions around complementarianism. There's going to be tensions over infant baptism. There's going to be a lot of tensions. And that's always the way it works when you win politically. Right away, Steve Bannon and Elon Musk were like this. That's politics, and churches have politics too. So Snapper wanted me to talk more at the end of this. I don't have more. So I preached Sunday. The mic died, so I can't share the. I don't know how the recording went on the church website, but the rough draft is on the site. On the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus comes down from the mountain and gives it to his disciples. I'm not coming down from the mountain. I don't have a solution or a program or a platform to deliver to the Christian Reformed Church or the metagelical world. I don't have it. Now, if you ask me what I think we should do into the future, I would say watch what I do. Because obviously, what I do is the summary of what I think, at least that which is graspable by me and my shoestring operation here at the Livingstones World Ministry Center. If you want to keep Livingstones alive, The link to livingstonecrc.com/give is below. Your donations are welcome. I've done what I think I can with what I've got. And that's what I'm doing. So, yeah. And so Estuary, the TLC, my trips, that's what I think I can helpfully contribute from the chair I sit in and the part I play. And of course, the work that I do in classes, and still haven't decided if I should try to go to Synod this year. Should probably talk to my wife first. So yeah. That's what I think about the CRC right now. There's my update. And again, I'm always surprised how many non-CRC people really enjoy getting into this. So here it is. More CRC Inside Baseball. Leave a comment below.
Just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. No patriarch or any genitals are gonna stop the logos flowing theological. Amen, amen, amen. Amen, 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 amen. Oh, it's relation ontological, philosophy as well as lovely symbolology. 'Cause it's just you and me. We're fellowshipping and communing on the open sea. Amen, 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 amen. Sola Scriptura hagiography, the sacred dances and rejoices with the scrutiny. I'm just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. Amen, 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 amen. Amen, amen, amen. I'm just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. We're pointed up to New Jerusalem, but can't agree on where and how or if and when it be. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those against us, and lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen, 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 amen. I'm just a Midwest evangelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals.